In March 1936, a woman drove through the dusty fields of Central California, her car carrying a worn Graflex camera and a few rolls of film. Her name was Dorothea Lange, a government photographer documenting the lives of families uprooted by the Great Depression. The air was dry and restless that day, filled with the faint smell of burned beans from roadside camps. Along a narrow dirt road near the small town of Nipomo, she saw rows of makeshift tents made of burlap, cardboard, and broken wood. Inside them, families of migrant workers waited for the harvest that never came. Lange had been driving for hours, tired and ready to go home, but something in that landscape pulled her back. She turned her car around and followed her instinct into the camp. There, among the sagging tents, she noticed a woman sitting quietly in front of a small shelter, holding a baby in her arms while two children leaned against her shoulders. The woman's face was lined with exhaustion and worry, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. Lange lifted her camera and began to shoot, moving closer with each frame, capturing the silent strength of a mother who had nothing left to give except her will to survive. The encounter lasted less than 10 minutes, but in that brief moment she created an image that would define an era. The photograph would later be called Migrant Mother. It showed not just one woman, but the face of a nation in despair. When the image was published, Americans saw themselves reflected in her gaze. In that fragile instant of truth, Dorothea Lange had turned suffering into memory and poverty into conscience. By 1936, the Great Depression had reached a depth where numbers no longer captured reality. Reports spoke of millions unemployed and thousands of farms lost, but behind those figures lived a nation of people who had been stripped of identity and direction. Across the Great Plains and the Midwest, years of drought and dust storms had turned fertile land into barren soil. Families who had once depended on the earth found it turning against them. Crops failed, banks foreclosed, and entire towns emptied as farmers loaded their remaining belongings onto trucks and headed west. California became the imagined refuge, a place whispered about in letters and newspapers as a land of fruit and work. Yet when the migrants arrived, they discovered fields already full and wages falling. Thousands built shelters from scrap metal, cardboard, and rags on the edges of towns. They lived without plumbing or electricity, surviving on beans, bread, and hope. Children walked barefoot through mud, and parents searched endlessly for seasonal work that lasted only days. Disease spread through the camps, and local residents often treated the newcomers as intruders. The newspapers called them migrant workers, a phrase that reduced their lives to movement and labor. Few photographers or writers entered their camps. Their suffering existed in silence, far from the headlines about Wall Street recovery or government plans. The nation debated economic theory while mothers tried to keep their children warm under canvas roofs. By the time Dorothea Lange arrived with her camera, the crisis had become invisible not because it had ended, but because people had stopped looking. Dorothea Lange had begun her career as a portrait photographer in San Francisco, capturing the faces of the city's wealthy residents during the prosperous 1920s. When the Great Depression struck, she turned her camera outward, away from studios and toward the streets. She photographed the unemployed waiting in bread lines, men sleeping on sidewalks, and women standing in front of pawnshops. Her style shifted from composition to compassion. She sought not perfection of form but authenticity of emotion. By 1935, her work had drawn the attention of federal officials organizing the Resettlement Administration, a New Deal agency created to document the social cost of economic collapse. The Resettlement Administration, later renamed the Farm Security Administration, hired photographers to record the struggles of displaced farmers and migrants across the United States. Their mission was both bureaucratic and moral. They were asked to provide evidence for government reports, yet what they produced became something far greater, a portrait of a nation in transition. Under the guidance of economist Roy Stryker, photographers like Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein, Ben Shahn, and Dorothea Lange traveled thousands of miles, capturing the forgotten edges of America. Lange's empathy and precision made her images distinct. She often spoke of photography as an act of witnessing rather than creation. Her camera became an instrument of testimony, showing the human face behind abstract policy. Each photograph she sent to Washington carried a silent question about responsibility. In an era defined by economic data and political speeches, her work revealed what statistics could not measure: the endurance and vulnerability of ordinary people. In early March 1936, Dorothea Lange was driving north through California after a long assignment photographing migrant camps for the Resettlement Administration. She had spent weeks documenting workers who followed the harvest from field to field and was exhausted from travel. Her car was loaded with exposed film, and her mind was fixed on returning home to Berkeley. Passing through the town of Nipomo, she noticed fields of wilted pea plants ruined by frost. The crop had failed, and the workers who had come to pick it were left stranded without food or wages. She drove several miles past the area before an uneasy feeling made her slow down. Something told her she had missed what she came for. She turned her car around and went back toward the camp. Down a dirt road, she found a small settlement of 20 or so tents and makeshift shelters made from canvas, old tires, and wood scraps. The people inside were thin and tired, their clothes coated with dust. Among them she saw one woman who caught her attention immediately. The woman sat in front of a torn tent with a baby in her lap and two children leaning against her shoulders. Her posture was still, her gaze distant, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Lange approached quietly and asked if she could photograph her. The woman agreed without hesitation, too weary to ask questions. Lange took 6 photographs with her Graflex camera, moving gradually closer with each frame. The sequence captured the woman's face from different angles, the small hands of the children, and the fragile texture of the tent behind them. After finishing, Lange thanked her subject and left. She did not even record her name. That short encounter, lasting less than 10 minutes, produced the image that would become one of the most powerful visual testaments of the Great Depression. On the film that Dorothea Lange developed after returning home, there was no sign of arrangement or direction. The sequence of 6 negatives revealed a moment of raw honesty that no composition could have improved. In the final frame, the woman sat with one hand pressed against her cheek, her eyes looking past the camera into an undefined distance. Her children leaned against her shoulders, their faces turned away, as if hiding from the world. The baby in her lap slept beneath a thin blanket. The light was soft and diffused through the tent's fabric, giving the scene a quiet dignity that contrasted with the hardship it depicted. Later research identified the woman as Florence Owens Thompson, a 32-year-old mother of 7. She was a Cherokee woman born in Oklahoma who had traveled west during the Depression in search of work. Her family had been living in the pea pickers' camp after the harvest failed. They had sold the tires from their car to buy food and were surviving on boiled vegetables and scraps. Lange never learned her name at the time. She sent the negatives directly to the Resettlement Administration office and to the editors of the San Francisco News. Within 2 days, the newspaper printed the photographs along with a short article about the starving farmworkers near Nipomo. The images immediately drew attention from readers across the state. Relief supplies were dispatched to the camp, and within 24 hours food and tents arrived for the families stranded there. What had begun as a brief stop on a dusty road became a visual document that exposed the silent suffering of thousands. Through her lens, Lange had transformed one family's despair into a universal symbol of endurance. The publication of the photograph produced a reaction that surpassed all expectations. When the San Francisco News ran the story on March 11, 1936, readers were confronted not with statistics, but with the face of a mother staring into uncertainty. It was the first time many Americans had seen the Depression not as an abstract crisis but as a personal tragedy. Letters poured into the newspaper offices, demanding that the government provide immediate aid to the migrant families trapped in the frozen pea fields near Nipomo. For those who had followed months of reports about unemployment and crop failure, the image carried a truth that words could not express. Within 24 hours, trucks loaded with food, medicine, and supplies were sent to the camp by the State Relief Administration. The action was swift and direct, driven entirely by public outrage. Relief workers found that most of the migrants had already dispersed in search of new jobs, but the photograph had already done its work. It forced officials to recognize that the migrant crisis was not a temporary inconvenience but a humanitarian disaster, When the image reached Washington, it was circulated among the offices of the Resettlement Administration and the Farm Security Administration. Officials used it to advocate for increased funding of emergency programs for displaced farmers. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was briefed on the situation and approved additional support for migrant aid initiatives. The photograph became a silent form of protest, a picture that demanded compassion without slogans or speeches. It proved that empathy, once awakened, could move faster than bureaucracy. For Dorothea Lange, the image marked a turning point, showing that a single moment of truth could alter the course of public conscience. The photograph quickly became one of the most recognizable images in American history. Copies circulated through newspapers, schools, and government archives, often without credit to either the photographer or the woman in the frame. It appeared in exhibitions organized by the Farm Security Administration and was used in countless articles and reports to represent the suffering and resilience of Depression-era families. For the public, the woman's lined face and distant eyes came to embody the collective struggle of a nation. The image transcended documentation and became a symbol of endurance and dignity under unimaginable hardship. Yet for Florence Owens Thompson, the recognition brought no immediate relief. She continued to live the life of a migrant worker, moving from farm to farm across California with her children, picking cotton, beans, and fruit. The photograph that moved a country did not change the poverty it depicted. She remained unaware of its fame for many years, and when she learned about it later, she felt both pride and discomfort. She feared that the world had seen her as a symbol of despair rather than as a survivor who never gave up. Decades later, during the 1970s, journalists traced her identity and interviewed her family. They revealed that she had rebuilt her life, raised her children, and never accepted charity beyond necessity. Her daughter described her as a woman of strength who refused to be defeated by circumstance. By then, the photograph had entered museums and history books as Migrant Mother, a universal image of human perseverance. The story of Florence Owens Thompson reminded viewers that behind every symbol of suffering stood a real person who had lived, fought, and endured far beyond the frame. Over the years, the photograph became more than a historical document. It became a mirror in which America recognized itself. Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother revealed not only the hardship of poverty but also the quiet nobility that endured within it. Viewers did not see weakness in the woman's face but a strength that transcended circumstance. Each wrinkle, each uncertain gaze beyond the camera, spoke of endurance and hope. For a generation that had lived through the Great Depression, the image became a form of collective memory. It reminded people that behind every statistic lay a family, behind every government report stood a mother trying to feed her children from an empty pot. As time passed, the photograph took on a life of its own. It was reprinted in textbooks, displayed in museums, and analyzed by historians, sociologists, and artists. It became one of the most reproduced images in the world, symbolizing both the failure and the humanity of an era. Filmmakers and advertisers borrowed its composition, echoing its emotional honesty. The woman's expression became a universal emblem of resilience, often invoked in times of crisis far removed from the depression that had created it. For Dorothea Lange, the photograph stood as proof that empathy could be recorded on film. She often said that the camera was an instrument that taught people how to see without prejudice. Migrant Mother did exactly that. It turned suffering into understanding and transformed a forgotten family into an enduring testament of dignity. In the face of despair, it captured the possibility of compassion, ensuring that the memory of those years would never fade into abstraction. The story of Dorothea Lange was the story of how vision could shape a nation. She had no authority, no office, and no voice in government, yet her camera became an instrument of empathy in an age defined by numbers and policies. While others measured recovery in charts and statistics, she sought truth in faces. Through her lens, the abstract suffering of millions became human again. The image of the migrant mother did not shout or accuse. It simply existed with an honesty that could not be ignored. It reminded a country that compassion was not a weakness but a form of strength. In a decade when words often failed, her photograph spoke through silence. It revealed that the power to move hearts did not depend on speeches or legislation but on the courage to look closely at pain. The quiet dignity of the woman and her children showed that endurance itself was a kind of defiance. It taught that art, when born of sincerity, could reach beyond its frame and become moral memory. For Lange, photography was never about fame or beauty, it was about bearing witness. She believed that seeing was a moral act, that awareness could lead to change. Migrant Mother fulfilled that belief. It turned despair into meaning and transformed a fleeting moment on a dirt road into a national conscience. Long after the Great Depression ended, the image continued to ask the same unspoken question: what does humanity owe to those who suffer in silence? In that question, and in the gaze of one woman from Nipomo, America found a reflection of its own soul.